Hi folks, welcome to the video on workflow. In this video, we're going to talk about things like taking notes and developing study skills that will help you perform better and learn more in the classroom. We talked a little bit about starters. The typical starters that you're going to have when you first walk in are either independent reading or timed writing. During timed writing, your goal is to write as much as possible for the entire time. Don't stop writing, and we'll talk a little bit more about the importance of this in just a moment. When we think about independent reading, reading is an incredibly complex and important activity for your brain. When you read, your brain is not just reading the words on the page. Your brain is involved in one of the most highly intellectually stimulating activities it could possibly do. Your brain is using your visual cortex to see the things on the page. It's interpreting what it sees as symbols, and it's turning those symbols into language. That language it then has to turn into meaning. It's also accessing your memory in order to remember the different things that happen in the story. You're using your imagination to fill in the details and imagine these characters. You're interpreting different actions of the characters and motivations. You're forming judgments about who you like and who you don't like, and what's good and what's bad in the story. And you're making predictions about what could happen in the future. Basically, reading is like going to the gym for your brain. It's like one of the best workouts you could ever do for your brain. If you don't take your brain to the gym, it ends up this puny little weak thing that can't really think through a problem. But if you read, your brain becomes like the rock. It becomes huge and strong and able to talk about issues and solve problems easily. Now that we talked a little bit about why we read, let's talk about the importance of why we write for the entire time when we do timed writing. So when you learn, your brain forms connections. And then when you think, your brain explores those connections. When someone is able to make a lot of connections, that person seems smart. And when someone is not able to make connections, that person seems not so smart. We write to practice making connections in our brain and get smarter, not just to answer the question. So we can see here this network of connections in the brain. This is literally the way that the brain works. Every time you read something or you explore an idea, your brain makes more connections. So if somebody has a lot of connections and you ask that person a question, that question goes into their ears and it enters the brain and it goes through whatever connections are available. And if that person has a very dense neural network of connections with all kinds of connections inside, they're able to think about that particular idea or concept in great detail. If somebody doesn't have a lot of connections, when that problem goes into their ear and enters the brain, then it doesn't have a lot of places to go. And of course, that person's not going to have a lot of things to say about that problem, and they're not going to have very innovative solutions because they have limited brain activity inside of their neural networks. What we want to do is we want to learn to flex those neural networks. We use reading in order to create connections, and we write for the entire time so that our brain gets stronger at reaching out and making connections between all those things that we know, that we've experienced, that we've learned previously. We want these connections to be very deep, and we want your brain to get in the habit of being able to make these connections. If we take somebody and we ask a question like, "What did you learn this weekend?" They may think about it for a second and say, I don't know. If they say, "I don't know," then what happens? Well, all the activity in the brain dies. They don't have to think about it anymore. They've answered your question. They've said, "I don't know." And they've answered the question without any brain activity at all. But if a teacher asks somebody, "What did you learn this weekend?" and somebody is forced to write for the entire time, then their brain actually makes more of an effort to reach out and make all these connections. The brain accesses the memory in order to think about what happened this weekend. It puts events into context and order. Then it extracts meaning from those events in order to develop a thought about what was learned. That's an extremely complex mental task. The more we train our brains to be active rather than lazy, to make an effort to make those connections, the more easily and readily your brain is going to be able to make those connections. That's why it's so important for us to write for the entire time. What we're doing is not just answering the question. What we're doing is making connections. Answering the question is not the main idea. It is not the main purpose of the activity. The main purpose of the activity is for you to make as many connections as possible and put those connections in complete sentences so that you're using your language capabilities in cooperation with your thinking capabilities. Now that we've talked about the importance of reading and the importance of writing for the entire time when you're doing your starter, let's talk a little bit more about what goes on during the class. So sometimes in the class, you and your classmates will have to work on the same shared Google document. Think about what kind of difficulties you could see happening if there are a lot of people on a single document working all at once. You could end up with students erasing one another's work or messing with your font or changing your wording. Those are all not very good working environments. response. What we need to do is we need to come up with some agreements. Some agreements about things that we will and won't do. When I say go, open up your notebooks and write a T-chart in there just like this, with do's on one side and don'ts on the other. Take 3 minutes and go ahead and fill out this T-chart on things that you think are some of the do's and don'ts when working together like this. Ready, set, go. Okay, we're back. Now that we know how we should act when we're working on Google Documents as a whole group, let's talk a little bit about our notebooks. You need to bring your notebook every single day, every class. Make sure that you have it because a lot of times you'll be doing the starter in the notebook. You may not leave your notebook in the class. You need to leave it in your bag, take it home with you, and then bring it back with you every day. This encourages responsibility. The teacher's not responsible for keeping your notebook. You are. You have to keep track of it. Lastly, always use Cornell Notes when you're taking notes in your notebook. Understand this about your notes. Your notes reflect your thinking. If your notes are disorganized and you can't tell one thing from another, it means your thinking is disorganized and you probably don't know or understand one thing from another. Organizing your notes is organizing your thinking. This is why organizing your notes is so important. I expect that when I look at your notebooks, I see that you're keeping your notebooks organized and clean. Write clearly. Use headings and bullet points in order to keep things organized. Here are some further notes about notebook organization. First, never skip a page or even half a page. Always pick up in your notebook exactly where you left off. You may use a solid line across the page to divide sections or dates. That's okay. Write on both sides of the page, not just on the front. And if you ever forget your notebook, you must borrow a page from someone else and paste those notes into your notebook by the time the next class begins. So we're going to talk about Cornell Notes now. So when you look at your page, you'll notice that you have that red line running down the left-hand side. We call that the left margin. Unfortunately, that left margin is not enough room for us to keep notes. So we're going to have to draw another line just a few inches over. You can see how much room I left between the end of the page and the line that I drew. We're going to use that area for headings. Here's an example of the types of notes that I'm going to keep. You'll see that every single time I start a new entry, I begin with the date. Underneath the date, I keep the heading for whatever I'm keeping in my notes. On the right-hand side, first I write the prompt or question. This is super important. If you come in and there's a starter on the board, you have to start by rewriting the prompt or question. And then underneath where I rewrote the question, that's where I write my response. Remember, it's timed writing, so I write for the entire time, making as many connections as possible. The answer to the question matters much less than the number of connections I'm able to make to the question. Once you're done with the starter, the teacher may give additional notes. If the teacher is giving other notes, then you may keep the headings for the notes on the left-hand side, and then keep the notes on the right, and then continue to add as many notes as you need for as long as the heading is relevant. So that's Cornell Notes. Now that we understand Cornell Notes, let's talk about responding to questions when you're writing. You already know that you have to copy the question, and you already know that you have to write for the entire time. But let's talk for a minute about how you start a response. Every time you write a response to a question, you must phrase the response in a way that uses all of the keywords from the question. The reader of your response should be able to understand what the question is without ever having read it. This is what that means. If I ask the question, where does Scrooge McDuck store all his money? You cannot say, in a vault. That is not a valid answer. You have to include in your response all of the key words from the question. I know that the key words in there are Scrooge McDuck, store, and money. I need to use all those words in my response. So I respond, Scrooge McDuck stores all his money in a vault. Let's look at another example. If I ask, what is the meaning of life according to Douglas Adams? Now, to answer this question, you have to understand that Douglas Adams was a writer of a really famous book called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, aliens built a supercomputer that compounded complex mathematical formulas in order to come up with the meaning of life. And their meaning of life, according to the aliens, is 42. Now, you cannot answer this question, what is the meaning of life according to Douglas Adams, simply by saying 42. You have to use the keywords from the question, the words meaning of life and Douglas Adams. So the correct response to this question would be, according to Douglas Adams, the meaning of life is 42. You can see how this makes your responses to questions much longer, even when initially you would think that you could give just a 1 or 2 word response. But you can't. You need to put your responses into full sentences. This improves our language thinking capabilities, and it's very important that we develop these mental habits. Lastly, if somebody asks, what makes somebody a hero? We can't just say, giving your life to a greater cause. If somebody wrote the words, giving your life to a greater cause, on a piece of paper, all by itself, and they dropped it on the stairs, and a stranger picked it up, they would open it up and they would see the words, giving your life to a greater cause, and they would have no idea what that's talking about. You have to include the key words from the question so that if a stranger who has no idea what the question was were to pick up the words and read, giving your life for a greater cause is what makes a person a hero, they understand the complete idea that you're trying to express. Now that we understand every time you write a response to a question, you must phrase the response in a way that uses all of the key words from the question. Let's talk about study skills. A lot of students don't know how to study. They think that just rereading their notes is studying, but that's really ineffective. So let's talk about what is effective. These are 3 strategies for how to study that can improve your overall learning. First, copy all your notes from slideshows and instructional videos into your notebook. This means when it comes time to study, you need to go back to the Google Classroom, look through all of the Google slide presentations that the teacher's given, rewatch all of the videos that they posted to the Google Classroom. Do this with your notebook open and taking notes on every single one of those. Next, rewrite and organize your notes using different organizational strategies. We can start including T-charts, Venn diagrams, and other types of organizational charts that can help us organize our thinking, which is really what we're trying to do here. Lastly, make study cards. Use little 3x5 cards where you put one word on one side and then a response that you want on the back side. Making study cards is a great way to drill definitions and study for exams. Understand this about studying. Studying has to encourage active interaction with ideas and concepts because remembering and understanding happens at higher rates with more active activities. Rereading something is passive activity in which you will remember very, very little. Rewriting is an active activity. Handwriting is more active than typing. Reorganizing is more active than copying. Studying note cards is great because you learn as you write the note cards and you learn as you use them to practice. To learn, you have to make ideas and concepts more interactive. This is the goal of writing notes, taking notes on old material, reorganizing notes, and crafting study cards. All of those things make studying an active process where you are interacting with the ideas, not just passively rereading them. When you reread something, you get a little bit of an illusion that you know it. You think, yeah, that makes sense. I've read that before. I already have that in my brain, so I must know it. But you can't actually use the information yet. You haven't mastered it. You won't master the information until you start manipulating the information, until you start interacting with the information. Writing the information, reorganizing the information is how you interact with it. And that's why these study techniques are so powerful. Remember, interactivity is what makes taking notes so important. We take notes to learn as well as to provide a resource to go back and remember. So that's it for our video on workflow, on how we should take notes and study in the classroom. In the next video, we're going to talk about behavior and how we should act in the classroom.